Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger, and I'm a professor of history at UT Austin. Kirill is my co-host.
Thank you very much, Mary. Yes, it's Friday. Again, all things Balkan. My name is Kirill Avramov. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at UT Austin, and your very proud co-host for this wonderful series that brings people that are interested in literature, art, culture, science, and all things Balkan. And my understanding, Mary, today is that you will introduce someone who is working on a topic that's close to your and my heart. And we're looking for a really great lecture.
That is correct. Before people logged on, we were talking about, I met Markus 10 years ago here in Austin. He came for a conference on food in Russia and Eastern Europe and gave a wonderful paper then. I don't know if you ever ended up publishing that work, but it was, you're like, what was it? But anyway, so I feel like I've known you now for 10 years, seen you on and off in the conference circuit. So it's really my pleasure today to have you on Balkan Circle. Markus has a PhD in history and civilization from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He's currently a professor of European history at the American University in Bulgaria. His publications include Market and Modernization, German-Bulgarian Economic Relations, 1918 to 1944, and Their Conceptual Foundations, which came out in 2007. He has a number of also publications in German, which I am not going to mispronounce for you, so I'm just going to go ahead and put those in the chat. I'm also excited for his upcoming co-edited book, Everyday Post-Socialism in Eastern Europe. History Doesn't Travel in One Direction. I love that title, which he co-edited with Jill Massino, and should be coming out this September. And so everybody should watch out for that. So today, sorry, I'm rechecking your title. Today he is speaking on Power, Nation State and Society, Constitution and Policymaking in Bulgaria, 1879 to 1944. So this should be a really interesting topic. Thank you for coming, Markus, and you can take it away.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Mary. Thank you also, Kirill. Also thanks to Kara, who set up the meeting and organized everything. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be back to Austin, even only online. I'd like to come back in person, of course, at some point. I mean, Mary has also been here to Blagoevgrad. We've seen each other here as well. And I hope, of course, we can all get together then on the next ACES in where will it be, in Boston, I think, this year. Right. Yeah. So the topic I'm going to talk about is indeed the role of the Constitution in Bulgarian politics, so specifically the Constitution of Turnovo, that's what I'm talking about. Simply because I've made a couple of observations when dealing with this. So the context within which I came in touch with the constitutional history of Bulgaria is a handbook of European constitutional history, which is currently being edited by Professor Werner Daum at the University of Hagen in Germany. So a couple of years ago, they approached me and asked me whether I wanted to write the chapter about Bulgaria for that handbook on European constitutional history. Before that, I have never really been in touch with that field, but so this way I got into that. And when studying specifics and developments, particularly with regard to the Turnovo Constitution, I made a couple of observations that I'm basically putting together here in this lecture that I'm presenting tonight or today, depending on your time zone. So One point that was brought up also by other scholars that I discussed my research with is the observation that Bulgaria actually abolished the monarchy relatively late. Yeah? So formally in 1946. Up until that point, basically formally, that the Turnovo constitution remained in effect. From 1947 onwards, we have then the so-called Dimitrov constitution in Bulgaria. So the communist regime basically with its own constitution. Yeah, Bulgaria abolished its constitution relatively late as compared to many other countries in Europe. Which have moved to a republican constitution basically after the First World War. So actually, among the countries that were on the losing side in the First World War, Bulgaria is the only one which keeps the monarchy and also keeps the constitution. So we actually have a continuity of the form of state, of government in Bulgaria, even across the catastrophe, as it is frequently called, of the loss of the First World War. And the search for reasons for this rather late abolition of the monarchy in Bulgaria in 1946 reveals one of the most astonishing features of the history of the modern nation state of Bulgaria, which has been found or was founded in 1878 after it separated from the Ottoman Empire. And this is the long duration and at least apparent stability of the constitutional monarchical order in Bulgaria. The astonishment is based not only on the large number of ruptures in the state life of Bulgaria in that period, so the constitution survived all these ruptures between 1878 and 1947, but it has also this astonishment also has to do with the quality of these ruptures, of which only the defeat of World War I might be mentioned here now as an example. The Turnovo constitution was in effect during this entire period, that is, after it came into effect in 1879 until it was finally then replaced by the Dimitrov constitution. Of course, it had already become obsolete with the communist takeover in September 1944. A year and a half later, the monarchy was formally abolished and the state was then transformed into a republic, albeit as a Stalin-style kind of republic. So the term People's Republic certainly did not correspond to common notions of a republic as a res publica. However, this apparent irony of history is supplemented by another arguably more important one. And this is the politically comparatively stable and sometimes even perceived as a stagnant period of the communist dictatorship, which lasted around 45 years, but did in fact experience a constitutional reform, the Zhivkov Constitution of 1971, while in the almost 70 much more unstable years, one could believe before 1947, the Turnovo Constitution was kept throughout this entire period, despite a few amendments that were made. This 70-year continuity guaranteed one thing above all: the continued existence of the constitutional monarchy as Bulgaria's form of government. It's fair to assume that it was this context that also motivated the elites in Bulgaria to refrain from a complete abolition of the constitution. The risk was too great that constitutional experiments could ultimately lead to a republic, contrary to the elite's intentions. And this might explain why conflicts over the monarchy and the constitution from 1879 until the end of the Second World War were always conducted below the threshold of a final abolition of the constitution. This even applies to the temporary suspensions of the constitution from 1881 to 1883 under Prince Alexander of Battenberg, then a brief one also of 1923. But also it applies to the suspension of the parliament as an institution in the years from 1934 to 38. The interwar period and the years of the Second World War, I think, are of some particular importance in this context. And not only because this was the final phase of the Bulgarian monarchy, but also because in this interwar period and World War II period, the monarchy emerged actually as strengthened Particularly in the 1920s, it emerged as strengthened from the serious crisis into which the outcome of the First World War had plunged the country. But also in the following decade, the monarchy was able to expand its position of power to such an extent that it pretty much took the form of a royal dictatorship. So obviously, the time had not yet arrived for a Bulgarian republic after 1918, so that it remains to be discussed which factors ensured the monarchy's survival even after the defeat in the World War, and which factors brought it to an end after the Second World War, an end which was not questioned any time later, not even after 1989. So the function of the Turnavo Constitution as a guarantee of the monarchy's continuous existence should always be seen in the context of the tense relationship, if not actually a kind of a conflict between the monarchy and the constitution. This conflictuous relationship was the result of a permanent tendency of Bulgarian government policies to regard the constitution as an obstacle to the realization of their own goals and to circumvent it, or as it often happened, to break it openly. In other words, all of Bulgaria's rulers between 1878 and 1944, so Alexander von Battenberg, Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and his son Boris III, gave priority to their national and power political ambitions over constitutional norms. As long as they did not encounter any substantial resistance, however, there seemed to be no reason for them to amend or even to abolish the constitution. While Prince Alexander had initially, that is in 1881, still believed that he would have to get rid of the constitution completely, so he suspended it then for 2 years, developments up to the beginning of the First World War gave his successor, King Ferdinand, reason to believe that the constitution, and with it the principle of parliamentary constitutional monarchy, were no serious obstacle to the implementation of his claim to power. This assumption is confirmed not only by the unmistakable or the very open step of suspending the constitution between 1881 and 1883, but also by the ambitious policy of national unification pursued by Prince Alexander, but then also by King Ferdinand. So the assumption that they viewed the constitution as an obstacle, I mean here. It seems that they were primarily trying to gain legitimacy as successful rulers. So not representatives of the nation necessarily, but rulers. An endeavor that they believed they could not fulfill by submitting themselves to the primacy of the democratic institutions such as the parliament. So they defined their success as the completion of Bulgaria's national mission, that is, the unification of all territories claimed to be ethnically Bulgarian with the motherland. Also following the preliminary peace treaty of San Stefano of 1878. Boris III specifically can also be seen, so not only Alexander and Ferdinand, but also Boris can be seen as a ruler who was willing to sacrifice the constitution to this presumable national, but also his own personal power interests. And within this context, the ambition of realizing this territory according to the peace treaty of San Stefano became a fundamental concern of Bulgarian foreign policy in the following decades, so after 1879, and thus took actually practically constitutional character, since it was given priority and in a very constant way. It retained this character even when Bulgarian policy came into conflict with Russian expectations, as it happened in the Serbian-Bulgarian War of 1885-86, connected also with the acquisition or annexation of the province of Eastern Rumelia, which had remained Ottoman after 1878. So we're basically talking about territories that were essentially considered to be southern Bulgaria. In response to this unification, Russia ended its military cooperation with Bulgaria, and Serbia declared war on its neighboring country, which appeared to be weakened now without that Russian support, but actually won the war and subsequently emancipated itself from its role as a Russian satellite in the Balkans. Against the background of these contexts, the developments in the relationship between the monarchical institution and the constitutional foundations in Bulgaria should now be discussed in order to draw conclusions regarding the probably at least theoretical possibility of a republicanization of the country, if you want to call it that way. Now, as mentioned, the Tonopor Constitution was suspended by Prince Alexander in 1881. Although the suspension actually, the suspension ended in 1883, even though it had originally been planned to last until 1888. And during this period, those years, 81 till 83, Prince Alexander was granted unlimited, almost dictatorial power by the parliament, which he intended to use primarily for this expansion of Bulgarian territory, but also the modernization of the country according to his own ideas. Even though the suspension was then lifted after 2 years in 1883, and Alexander actually achieved his greatest success in this service of the nation, by annexing Eastern Romalia. He basically had to pay for this with his abdication, which was enforced by Russia. So one could basically believe that, yes, well, the constitution was suspended only for 2 years, but still, and his success, his major achievement, came after the suspension had been lifted. Still, the strong impression remains of an irreconcilable contradiction between the monarchical claim to power and constitutional law in Bulgaria. Alexander's successor, Prince Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha-Kohari, did nothing to counteract this impression. 8 years after his enthronement, so he came to the throne in 1887, 8 years after that, 1895, he implemented a so-called personal regime, which formally lasted until 1912. This step followed the dismissal of Prime Minister Stefan Stambulov, who was then also murdered by Macedonian Bulgarian nationalists due to his moderate Macedonian policy towards the Ottoman Empire. Now, after Ferdinand's recognition as Prince of Bulgaria, so in 1890, which also happened, in 1895, Ferdinand, now took really direct control of government with his personal regime by appointing cabinets that were dependent on him and reshuffling or completely replacing them at his own discretion. Under these circumstances, it was not necessary for Ferdinand to make any substantial changes to the constitutional law during this period that would have affected the power structures or to suspend the constitution again in whole or in part. Anyway, he had basically all the freedom when it came to pursuing expansionist efforts, irredentist efforts, so acquiring territories considered Bulgarian. Like Alexander, he initially seemed to take a promising path, and in 1908, taking advantage of the weakness of the Ottoman Empire caused by the Young Turk Revolution, he achieved the complete formal independence for Bulgaria, which was then proclaimed a kingdom. But even if these events, of course, did have constitutional relevance and were extremely significant for Bulgaria, they did not, however, bring about any far-reaching changes in the internal power structures of the state. Such changes only came, actually, the only exception here probably is indeed a change of the constitution, which came, or which happened in 1911, towards actually the end of Ferdinand's personal regime, when the king actually consolidated the power in his hands by modifying the text of the constitution. So one important aspect was now that he took the title Tsar of the Bulgarians. But what is probably more significant is a change in Article 7 of the constitution that was amended to allow the king to conclude and to sign, basically draft and sign international treaties without consent by the parliament. So basically, he took foreign policy completely into his own hands. And another change that was made, the legislative period of the parliament was shortened from 5 to 4 years. Now, shortly after this consolidation of royal power, Ferdinand embarked actually on a militant course on his mission to complete Bulgaria's national territory. So again, yeah, the in a way you can call it even the obsession with San Stefano, Bulgaria, yeah, and which can in a way definitely be considered paradigmatic for the country's foreign policy and had therefore at least quasi-constitutional status. The First Balkan War in 1912 illustrates the extent to which the regime linked the question of its success to the fulfillment of this national mission and therefore gave it high priority. It was undoubtedly also the main reason for which later Soviet Marxist historiography called this policy adventurism, into which Ferdinand plunged the country in the following years. So after the First Balkan War, we got the Second Balkan War in 1913 due to the unfulfilled ambitions regarding Macedonia in the First Balkan War. And then from 1915, Bulgaria's participation in the First World War to revise the defeat in the Second Balkan War of 1913. As this endeavor also failed, Ferdinand was forced to abdicate in 1918 and hand over the throne to his son Boris III. As a monarch who was generally considered to have failed, he left behind chaos, not only from a national but also from a constitutional point of view. It does not seem too much to say that under Ferdinand's government, Bulgaria's political culture had developed to such an extent that the general respect for the Turnover Constitution as the normative legal text for political decision-making had suffered considerable damage. The monarchy had proved to be a state institution that was fundamentally opposed to the constitutional order and was prepared to subordinate this order to its national political priorities at any time. The defeat, which was also called a national catastrophe, also in connection with the Peace Treaty of Neuilly, could probably have led to a revolutionary abolition of the monarchy, for example, like in Germany. But Bulgaria, as I've mentioned before, remained the only European losing state of the First World War in which there was no such change of a system, but rather actually, at least from a formal viewpoint, an orderly and constitutional abdication by the ruler and assumption of the royal insignia by the heir to the throne. However, in addition to the outcome of the war, the monarch's opposition to constitutionally anchored parliamentary democracy, which had been practiced, so the opposition which had been practiced in the preceding decades, would have served actually as an additional argument in favor of transforming the country into a republic. So not only the war, but the general practice of acting against the constitution. Instead, Bulgaria not only experienced the continuous existence of the monarchy throughout the interwar period, but also, as mentioned before, its considerable strengthening in terms of power politics. Some sort of a broad public movement or even a revolution in favor of a republican constitution was obviously absent. And of course, this raises the question whether such forces even existed in the Bulgarian society after the end of World War I. King Ferdinand's abdication in favor of his son, King Boris III, had already taken place on October 3rd, 1918, which was basically just 5 days after the armistice of Thessaloniki had come into force, so Bulgaria exiting the war. So this could probably also explain why at least this was a moment in which the monarchy remained and was not overthrown, because there was neither, so the abdication, there was, yeah, basically no longer transitional period with Ferdinand at the head of the state, branded as the culprit of the national catastrophe, nor was there any form of an even short interregnum which could have served as an opportunity to abolish the monarchy. On the contrary, Bulgarian political life, at least apparently, continued in a remarkable order, stable order, in view of the crisis situation, and of course also the existing dissatisfaction among the population, the broader population. Despite the war losses and the destruction caused by the war, despite the difficulty of taking in refugees from ceded territories, despite the economic crisis caused by the war, the population did not rise to express any form of political will before the regular parliamentary elections of August 1919. These elections then indeed did demonstrate a rejection of the traditional political elites and their parties, that is, the conservatives and the liberals, which had dominated party life in Bulgaria before. Now they received less than 40% of the vote. The clear winners of this election were the Bulgarian Peasant People's Union, or Popular Peasant Union, under its charismatic leader Alexander Stambuliski. They won 31%. Then the communists won 18% and the Social Democrats 13%, which means that almost 2/3 of the voters had voted for parties that were actually opposed to the monarchy. In new elections, then held in March 1920, the Peasant Popular Union even received an absolute majority. Even if it may seem paradoxical, it was precisely, I believe, these electoral successes of Republican-oriented parties that contributed to the monarchy's survival in Bulgaria. The elections of August 1919, but even more those of March 1920, had shown that left-wing parties could come to power and rule within the framework of the constitutional order, so that a revolutionary overthrow of the monarchy was not needed, as it seemed. Especially under Stambuliski's government from 1920, King Boris was apparently no longer an obstacle to the realization of peasant class interests. So there seems to be an answer to the question why the defeat in the War of 1918 in Bulgaria was not followed by a revolution to abolish the monarchy. A revolutionary overthrow simply did not appear to be necessary. However, Stambuliski's policies, for example, the introduction of compulsory labor service in 1922, did increase fears about the among the monarchical and nationalist-minded elites that Stambuliski was, in fact, as this was their assumption, seeking a fundamental change of the system, a so-called dictatorship of the peasantry, which could ultimately lead to the abolition of the monarchy. As a result, efforts were made to overthrow the government of the Peasants' Union. From the point of view of nationalists, these efforts were given additional justification by Stambuliski's policy of rapprochement with the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes towards a settlement of the Macedonian question, which was actually the traditional Bulgarian claim, or touched the traditional Bulgarian claim that the people of Macedonia were, in reality, so to say, Bulgarians. This connection made it possible, ultimately, then for the Inner Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMRO, which represented this Bulgarian claim, to participate in a conspiracy against Stambuliski, which was, in addition, supported by the monarchist elites, including also the Union of the Reserve Officers and other veteran associations. This conspiracy resulted in the coup of the 9th of June 1923, benevolently observed by Boris III, who otherwise stayed in the background. And this coup then removed the Peasant Popular Union from power, established a new government of the so-called Demokratički Zgovor, so the democratic concord or agreement, which was a movement under then the new Prime Minister Alexander Tsankov, and was then also followed by the assassination of Stambuliski by IMRO activists. The following decade then brought a clear shift to the right in Bulgarian politics, which not only removed any doubt about the continuous existence of the monarchy, and also politically marginalized the protagonists, or at least presumable protagonists of republicanism, as a result of multiple terrorist measures, so terrorizing them, but also made actually the years of the peasant government from 1919 till 23, in retrospect, appear as simply a temporary retreat of the monarchist camp. This camp now benefited from the seemingly peculiar combination of two factors during these years. on the one hand, the unbroken continuity of the Turnovo Constitution, which provided the constitutional basis, as mentioned before, for the continuous existence of the monarchy, and on the other, the government of Republican-minded parties, which came to power in accordance with this constitution, but at the same time, in a way, kind of kept really revolutionary or subversive anti-monarchic tendencies under control, so that indeed the monarchist camp had to retreat temporarily, but was still strong enough to return then and strike back then through this coup of June 1923. These developments showed that the elites in Bulgaria deeply disrespected the constitution. But at the same time, these events during that time helped preserve their status during these early post-war years. So kind of really, it looks like a paradox in these historical developments. The development of monarchy and government in Bulgaria in the interwar period then points actually in this direction of a strengthening of the monarchy as a form of government, ultimately leading then to a form of this monarchic government for which the term royal dictatorship was often used, or at least could be used, and which was called monarcho-fascism in the Soviet Marxist historical jargon. The presumable tacit consent by King Boris to the June coup of 1923 indeed directly positioned the monarchy as a state institution among the opponents of the democratic order, and in retrospect appears to be an important step towards that monarchical authoritarian form of government which followed later. After 1923, it seems actually that the Bulgarian constitution has even further lost relevance, at least as far as it had been serving a function of containing and limiting the exercise of power by the government. An example of this is the famous Tsankov terror, named after the new prime minister, which directly followed the dismissal, or the overthrow actually, of the Stamboliski government. Among other things, it resulted in a violent reckoning with the leading functionaries of the Peasant Party, but also a ban of the Communist Party following the so-called September Uprising of 1923 and the attempt on Boris' life, on King Boris' life in the Sveta Nedelya Church in Sofia in 1924. These terror measures were accompanied by a legislation that was clearly in contradiction with Bulgaria's constitutional order. The law for the protection of the state, as it was officially called, of 1924, foresaw draconian punishments for any political activity classified as presumably criminal or violent, whether physical or merely journalistic or artistic, and enabled the government to completely eliminate basic civil rights and liberties at its own discretion. The law served as the legal basis for the Tsankov terror, which was only kind of limited and toned down from 1926 onwards, then under the new prime minister, Andrei Lapchev. At the same time, however, Boris III, the king himself, did not come to the foreground as a political decision maker in those years between 1923 and then ultimately 1935. However, there is kind of a consensus that he had significant influence on the course of events from the mid-1930s at the latest then. Also in connection then with the coup of May 19th, 1934, through which the elitist right-wing and corporative state-oriented association Zveno came to power, then under Prime Minister Kimon Georgiev, again, by the way, with the help of the Union of Reserve Officers. Even in connection with this coup, Boris remained in a benevolent observing role, proving himself to be at least a sympathizer of right-wing authoritarian, or if you will, even fascist actors, now for the second time since 1923. In retrospect, the developments in Bulgaria between 1923 and 34 led to some significant results regarding the position of the monarchy in Bulgarian political life. They resulted in an almost complete marginalization of the political left, generally Republican-minded parties, so that republicanism in Bulgaria was no longer politically represented in the public sphere. After the June coup, 1923, the Bulgarian Peasant Popular Union sank into insignificance, also without its outstanding leader, Alexander Stambulisky. The Bulgarian Workers' Party, the Communists, were even forced into illegality after the September uprising of 1923, so that its leaders were forced to emigrate. Among them, for example, the first communist leader after the Second World War, Georgy Dimitrov. From then on, the monarchy was no longer seriously threatened or even only questioned, in contrast to the constitution itself, which was indeed on the verge of being abolished in the years following the May coup of 1934, and actually, as it seems, owed its survival entirely to the lack of any convincing alternatives. These years, however, were also at the same time characterized by repeated open breaches of the constitution. These breaches were enforced by this coup regime without any significant resistance, but without formally suspending the constitution. So in a way, we can say the constitution became dead letter. In this context, maybe many know about this dissolution or abolishment of the parliament between 1934 and 1938. So basically, actually, the de facto elimination of parliamentary democracy, connected with a ban on all political parties. So the introduction of the so-called non-party or the partyless regime. In addition, there was also an unconstitutional centralization of state administration, depriving regional and municipal structures of their influence and competencies. And the extent to which the king at that time, so we're talking 1934-35, controlled political developments in Bulgaria at this time. So the extent to which he controlled things was demonstrated then when he dismissed Prime Minister Kimon Georgiev, who in his eyes had proven incapable of initiating the desired monarchical state restructuring of the system, and actually at some point even had surprisingly shown anti-monarchical tendencies. So he was removed in April 35, and then Andrei Toshev was appointed as the new head of government. He was now really completely dependent on Boris. So from 1935, we can say that he had effectively taken power. With Toshev and then Toshev's successor from 1936 onward, Prime Minister Georgy Ivanov, the establishment of a monarchical authoritarian state was now openly pursued. And the abolition now, really the formal abolition of the Turnover Constitution, was also directly considered. However, after several newly drafted constitutions failed to gain acceptance, the monarch, the king, decided to continue ruling in this authoritarian way while formally keeping the existing constitution in effect. The regime propagated now a new form of national state with a conflict-free society that would diligently serve the development of Bulgarianness, so to say, and this propaganda also surrounded Boris now with the aura of a leader responsible only to God and history, as it was formulated. Even though these developments must also be viewed against the background of right-wing authoritarian tendencies throughout Europe at the time and in the context of Bulgaria's intensifying rapprochement with Nazi Germany, the internal Bulgarian context seems to play also an important role, I believe. The almost uninterrupted conflict between the institution of the monarch and the parliamentary democratic constitutional order, which dates back indeed to the beginnings of post-Ottoman Bulgaria, allows the developments of the 1930s to be interpreted in retrospect as a continuation of power political traditions and, if we like, a constitutional culture in the country, or if you will, a constitutional non-culture or non-constitutional culture. However, it is not possible, however, to call the system after 1935 a totalitarian one. Boris himself actually deliberately kept radical right-wing or fascist groups away from power, certainly also fearing that they would also ultimately take an anti-monarchic direction. And none of these groups at any time had really significant political influence. After the suspension of the parliament in 1934, the ban on political parties and the establishment of this authoritarian government, so after the suspension, the return to parliament, and in 1938, albeit very limited, appears actually as something remarkable. On the one hand, the royal regime was obviously keen to at least maintain the facade of a constitutional democratic government, giving the impression that from the viewpoint of those in power, the constitution could still not simply be ignored. On the other hand, even the very narrowly defined limits on parliamentary participation did not offer the opposition any opportunity to influence political decision-making. However, they could still make their own views heard. In other words, a political public actually did exist to a certain degree, and the parliament proved to be more than a mere acclamation organ of the government. And in some, in a few cases, even voted down motions that had been submitted by the government. So this controlled parliamentarism came about through the enactment of a new electoral law in 1937, which actually, however, guaranteed a comfortable majority for the respective government, which was dependent on the king. So again, so parliamentarism really only in a very limited way. Out of the 160 members of the parliament, which was elected in the winter of 1939-1940. So out of these 160, 140 were considered to be absolutely loyal to the regime. 20 were considered oppositional. Parties remained banned, so candidates were only allowed to run as individuals, and they had to declare officially that they had no links to parties. Of course, also candidates that were not liked somehow by the regime could be removed as well. So overall, the interwar period, but similarly the decades before it, appear to be a time of permanent conflict between the basic constitutional order and the institution of the monarchy in Bulgaria. Periods in which governments supported by a parliamentary majority were in power were by far the exception rather than the rule. Instead, Bulgarian politics was characterized by continuous attempts to establish authoritarian forms of government. The monarchy was always, at least from a constitutional perspective, a factor of unrest and disturbance in the state structure of Bulgaria. It is therefore, or it could be considered surprising, that the demand for the introduction of a republic was hardly ever at the center of political debates. Authoritarian tendencies remained rather separate from this question and seemed to be linked. So this was not really discussed when authoritarian, like Stamboliski, for example, came to power. So such authoritarian tendencies rather were linked to a general longing for charismatic leaders, for example, with the peasant leader Stamboliski, but also later King Boris III. Republicanism as a substantial and influential political movement is not to be found really, at least to a significant degree, in interwar Bulgaria. Therefore, we should not really talk of a belated republicanization of the country when it actually took place in 1946. A few years before still, in 1943, not even the sudden death, unexpected death of King Boris really shook the monarchy. The transition from him to the three-member Regency Council, which then exercised rule in the name of the minor Tsar or King Simeon II. So this transition took place smoothly. Maybe this could be explained by Bulgaria's position as an ally of Nazi Germany. So the uncertain times basically dictated a change of the system could not happen at that time. There were still German troops in the country, probably who could have then, they were there as allies, but who could then turn into an occupying power. So this certainly also it plays a role here, but still I also think that long-term social factors should be taken into account to explain why the monarchy in Bulgaria was hardly ever seriously challenged. And I'm just going to briefly touch upon these. One of the most important factors for within this context is certainly the socioeconomic condition of Bulgaria in the interwar period. More precisely, now more concretely, the ongoing predominantly traditional agrarian character of the society. For the question of the constitutionality of the Bulgarian state as a constitutional monarchy or republic, this is of significance insofar as some explanations can be derived from this, that is, from this continuous agrarian character of the economy and society in Bulgaria, for the fact that the Turnavo constitution had only actually a very limited influence on the political and social realities in the country and reflected these just as little. So the Turnavo constitution was always much more some sort of a program image of represented the image of a modern Bulgarian society towards which the really existing Bulgarian society would move in the long run. So in Bulgaria, until the First Balkan War, but basically until the end of the Second World War, if you want to put it this way, pre-industrial and in rural areas subsistence and thus pre-capitalist economic forms remained dominant. The overwhelming majority, therefore, of Bulgaria's society was characterized actually by a relatively wide distance from the state. This remoteness from the state, so basically living in a separate world, in a world that was separate from the world of state, government, and policy making. This can be illustrated by looking at the limited opportunities, or this had to do also was connected with limited opportunities that the Bulgarian state had until the Second World War to influence society and also to implement its modernization concepts, for instance. The almost complete lack of a middle class, which could have served as a link between the thin urban elites and the rural population, had an extremely inhibiting effect on the state-initiated attempts to modernize the country economically and to industrialize it. This was evident, for example, from the fact that significant industries in Bulgaria only emerged when the state was directly involved as an investor and policymaker, such as in coal mining or in the railroads. While the policies that, for instance, were pursued from 1894 onwards to stimulate industrialization exclusively with the help of tax advantages that were given to enterprises, these policies had almost no effect. These social conditions corresponded to the fact that for most citizens, the question of monarchy or republic was just as remote as the state as a whole, and could probably only become significant when indeed a leading figure lent voice to the concerns of the peasant population, whether this was the ruler of someone else or someone else. So the question, I conclude, of monarchy or republic had, it seems, little mobilization potential. And republicanization, therefore, was never really openly declared a political goal, not even by Stamboliski when he was ruling with an absolute majority in the country. All right, so far my observations. Thanks for listening. And of course, I'm now happy to answer questions, remarks, criticism.
Thank you very much.
Wow, Markus, that was like wonderful. Like you have such a great voice, and it's really, I found that really mesmerizing, but also informative. So,
Well, thank you.
I think you kind of did a great job of sort of giving us this like really pointed analysis of all of kind of modern Bulgarian political history.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have questions. If people in the audience have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hands, but wait.
I
Oh,
think
that's not Kara, it's Deggy.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
let's.
Deg-
I was like,
Problem
Kara,
logging
raise your
in,
hand. Okay, I'll let Deggy go first. Go ahead. Like it says Kara, but that's actually Deggy.
Yeah,
Deggy, oops.
I actually should be able to
And maybe introduce yourself.
hear.
So-
Yeah, sorry. Hi, my name is Degi Opsh. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at UT Austin, and I'm also a proud alum of AUBG. So I've
wow.
had a chance to take a class with you, Professor Wien, but I was there when you started at AUBG. So it's great to see you here today, and I want to say hi first. I have two questions about your great work. So first is, I'm really intrigued by this idea that the electoral successes of the anti-monarchic political forces contributed to the survival of the monarchy, right? Like it's a paradoxical observation, given that these parties seem to be significant political forces getting up to like 1/3 of the vote. So I want to ask you to elaborate on the mechanism behind it a little bit. Modern dictators, they are said to use elections and electoral processes to legitimize themselves, right? So is it similar mechanism as what Putin does in Russia or other modern dictators do in modern contexts, do you think? Or was there something different that was at work there? So that's my first question. My second question is kind of outside the scope of your work, but I was wondering, what's the implication of your finding for modern day Bulgaria? So particularly this this idea that sometimes constitutions were seen as obstacles, right? Like, has it survived? Does it have any implication for how politics work, how constitution is thought of in modern day Bulgaria among voters as well as among the elites?
All right. Yeah. So so first about this paradox that the fact that I'm not saying openly anti-monarchic, but Republican-minded parties were in power, or particularly the one party, the Peasant Popular Union, so that they were in power, and that this, in a way, contributed. So I'm putting it in BZNS, exactly. So Bulgarski Zemedelski Naroden Soyuz. I'm putting or choosing my words carefully. Yeah? So I'm saying it contributed. I'm not saying that it's guaranteed, yeah, or that it was really the decisive factor, but I think it contributed because to me it seems that it did not, or did the abolition of the monarchy and a transition towards republic did not. It looked like, oh come on, it did not let this appear as a priority anymore. So, in other words, the supporters of that government, basically, even if they wanted to get rid of the monarchy, said, yes, okay, now we got the right people in power. We don't have to worry about this anymore. While the government itself by Stamboliski was obviously busy with other things, they also basically made the experience that they could implement their policies even without abolishing the monarchy. So in other words, that question appeared as not a priority, as not so relevant even anymore. Something that could be added here is also that under Stamboliski's government, actually some sort of a parallel state occurred in Bulgaria, with the help of these Orange Guards that were kind of a paramilitary organization to the disposal of Stamboliski. Yeah, we have here also the Orange Terror, exactly. Yeah. So that indeed kind of a separate second state actually occurred, which probably in the eyes of many people made the conventional, the established state, including also the question of republic versus monarchy, even less relevant. So this is my explanation. It's probably something that would deserve to be verified by looking at archival documents, even though I'm not sure exactly in which documents I should find this. Maybe there is even some sort of an explicit statement made by Stambuliski or another leading representative of the party, which is sleeping somewhere in the archives, but says, yeah, well, we don't really care. We don't have to care about the monarchy anymore. Anyway, they're not relevant. Yeah. And this is not a priority right now. Maybe we can deal with this later. So generally, they definitely did not have this on the top of their political agenda. And then the June coup of 1923 came and put an end to it anyway. So that's the explanation I can offer here. The other thing about today, Bulgaria, like the present day Bulgaria and constitutional life in Bulgaria, well, I have to say I'm a historian, so I mostly deal with the past and not so much with the present. But I believe that the constitutional order in Bulgaria is certainly more constitutional and stable than it has ever been in the interwar period. So we have seen regular changes of government. Of course, we've also seen a lot of instability. All we have to think of are these 5 elections which have happened in those years between, what was it, 2021 and 2022. Within 2 years, there were 5 elections. But on the other hand, these elections were always held in a regular way. We also have regular changes of government. For example, when this is something which could have in a way serve as a continuation of my story here. When Simeon then became Prime Minister of Bulgaria in 2001 after a victory in the elections of 2001 and a major defeat suffered by Ivan Kostov back then, but Kostov stepped back from his position and handed it over to the next prime. So there was a very regular transition of power in Bulgaria. So generally, I would say the constitutional order in Bulgaria works, is functional, I cannot really think of any, let's say, at least open policies towards changing the constitution. I mean, sometimes there were rumors. So of course there was the suspicion that Simeon II would probably at some point try to reintroduce the monarchy. There have been more recently, of course, also there was suspicion that the current president Radev wants to transform Bulgaria into a presidential republic, whatever this means. But at least as far as I can see, these things have never really gotten very far, actually. Does this answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much, Markus, and thank you for putting this into a wider perspective, with current events and this panoramic view of specifically about the Bulgarian instability. So before Mary and I continue with the questions, we do have one of our colleagues. It is Stephen Siegel that would like to ask a question. Stephen?
Hello.
Hi, Markus. How are you? I'm in a hallway and off camera, but I'll keep this very brief. Thanks so much for this really interesting talk. I know that you're a historian and don't like to comment on contemporary affairs, so I'm going to make you comment on a contemporary affair. Would you say a few things about the proposed amendments since, say, 2020? And what I'm thinking about here are current dialogues between the EU and NATO. I guess what I would really want to know is the issue of inviolability in the Bulgarian constitution, the sort of notion of territorial integrity in, like, say, contrast to Serbia and Bosnia and these issues of Greater Poland or Greater Hungary with Orban. or greater whatever, greater Lithuania, Sweden retaking the, like after yesterday's conversation between Carlson and Putin. So like, do you see any proposals ever happening within Bulgarian sort of like interest groups and amendments where the territorial inviolability of the Bulgarian state could be changed? Or is that just something that's a sort of like non-issue? And the corollary to that is that the EU and NATO obviously, I think at this point, would support borders staying where they are, borders being borders. So is this an issue? Because like I keep thinking about historical geography, you know, I'm obsessed with this, with maps, and how those changes come to be, especially with certain influence groups as they gain more members in parliament and potentially more members in the European Parliament, if that makes sense. So I guess, can you comment about contemporary amendments and how they're sort of like stalled, or how they go forward with your knowledge of Bulgarian constitutional history? And thank you so much for coming today.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So I mean, so you're talking about, let's say, the inviolability of borders, or
Territory, let's say.
so like potential territorial claims that Bulgaria could have against another country. Is this what you're meaning? What do you mean?
Yes.
All
So
right.
could
Yeah,
there
I mean,
ever
of
be
course,
an
this,
amendment?
yeah.
I mean, since we're talking about, yeah, go ahead.
This would of course point at towards Macedonia, right? There was also such a remark here in the
Yes.
comments here, Macedonian question 2.0. I mean, what is certainly kind of a problematic aspect of constitutional life in Bulgaria is really this definition of who or what the Bulgarians are. So we still have, of course, a very strong ethnic centered understanding of the nation. And this has definitely led to tensions and problems, particularly with regard to Macedonia. I don't see any similar problems with other countries, other neighboring countries. So it's really mainly with Macedonia. And I'm not aware that any like changes or amendments were planned to be made to the constitution with regard to this. It seems to me that all this this entire discourse actually develops, let's say, within the framework of the constitution, but the constitution itself, or the constitutional understanding of what the Bulgarians or who the Bulgarians are, is something that would probably deserve a discussion. But I don't see this here in Bulgaria. Yeah, there is a absolute, almost complete consensus that Bulgaria as a nation is largely and strongly defined on ethnicity, and also that, well, even those who would now acknowledge Macedonia as a separate state and even as a separate nation would say it is a very young nation going back, let's say, to 1945, also artificial, so to say. And everything that affects or relates to Macedonia before 1945 is part of Bulgarian history. So it's this understanding that of owning history, so to say. Yeah. And this is, of course, I mean, you could say, well, this is kind of a weird story if it would not have indeed political relevance. Bulgaria has been blocking the beginning of EU accession negotiations with Macedonia based on disagreements with the North Macedonian government on certain historical questions. So I find that the most kind of characteristic, but at the same time most, let's say, absurd dispute here is the question of whether Tsar Samuel of the early 11th century was Bulgarian or Macedonian or whatever. So really kind of projecting modern categories of nationality and nationhood back into the Middle Ages, by 1,000 years. And this is something that serious people do. This is not kind of, these are not marginal discourses. This is in the middle, so to say, of society. That's here. Right. Leading representatives of the state, again, I could mention President Radev here, really follow that same trend, the same tendency. By the way, Radev, and here actually we're getting really into the problem of the constitution here. There is now currently discussion about this a legal project to let's say broaden the options of dual citizenship in Bulgaria. Yeah? And Radev seems to be against this. Yeah? Because he says basically this would mean that there would be all those foreigners with Bulgarian passports. So there are foreigners with Bulgarian passports. In other words, even if you have a Bulgarian passport, you can still be considered a foreigner, which I think is something that is totally contrary to the constitution. It's unconstitutional to say something like that. So whether somebody has an additional citizenship or not, calling that person a foreigner with Bulgarian passport, to me, again, like actually indicates a great disrespect for the constitutional order of Bulgaria. So that's what I can say about, let's say, discourses that are relevant from the viewpoint of the constitution that have been happening in Bulgaria recently. Right. Yeah. So I don't know, Stephen, does this answer your question somehow, or?
Yeah, that's great, Markus. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's all I can say about this. So again, it's I'm a historian, yeah, so
Thanks.
in terms of questions related to the present, I'm a dilettante professionally, at least. Yeah.
I think I have questions too, but let's go ahead and go to Christian first. He's been patiently waiting.
Thank you, Mary. So thank you, Markus, for very interesting talk. So I know that you're probably very tired because it's 9 p.m. here in Bulgaria, but I have a very brief question. What do you think? Are you trying to compare? I mean, this type of ongoing, constant struggle between monarchy and constitutionalism here in Bulgaria. Is this some kind of, I mean, only Bulgarian model, or we are able to speak about some kind of common pattern across the Balkans? Are you trying to compare this issue with the situation in Greece or in Serbia, probably in Russia, because probably there will be some kind of similarities, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can of course compare, but once I would compare, I would also see differences. So I think that the case with the monarchy, I mean, Bulgaria is, to my knowledge, at least the at least theoretical possibility of re-establishing the monarchy was more than just an idea, or reached really to the level of more than just an idea. Yeah, with the return of Simeon II, Simeon becoming prime minister. So no former Eastern European or a Southeastern European monarch has ever come as close to power as Simeon. Yeah? And even though Simeon himself never publicly declared that he was planning to reinstitute the monarchy, definitely his victory in the 2001 elections was absolutely owed to his, let's say, royal aura that came with him. So this is basically what I think had played a decisive, a crucial role in him winning the elections. However, I think the fact that he won the elections and had to become prime minister then was actually going against his original plans. He did not expect such a groundbreaking victory in the 2001 elections and expected actually to play some sort of a significant role in Bulgarian policymaking as a member of parliament, probably, and then at some point maybe run for the presidential elections, become president, and then in a way transform the presidency back into a monarchy. I mean, I'm just speculating, but this is something which at least would make sense to me. This is something that, but he became prime minister and had to make policy. He had to run the government. And this running the government with all the things that went right and all the things that went wrong basically kind of cut him down to the status of a normal prime minister. And therefore, he then also, in a way, consequently lost the elections then in 2005. So that it seems to me that, so when they realized he cannot do wonders, miracles, so he lost the elections. Exactly, he had promised he had promised a miracle, 800 days it would take him to improve the situation in Bulgaria. This did not happen, so he lost the elections. And therefore, I think what is certainly more important with regard to Simeon is indeed this expectation that he is kind of the strong man, the strong leader, the charismatic leader who would put things right. The fact that he had this royal background was helpful and helped him win the elections. But it was important and relevant only insofar as it would also, it gave him credibility as kind of the messianic leader who would now come back and put things right. And this search for messianic leaders, this is something we also see in other countries. The Bulgarian case is specific insofar as we really have a former king who now comes back and becomes a prime minister in a republican system. This is very specific. We don't see this in any other country. But what it has in common with other countries is this expectation of messianic, charismatic leadership, basically. This is what it's about, rather. Right. So far, I think that's what I can say.
Thank you. That makes us unique some kind.
Yeah, indeed. No, we don't have any similar case, I think. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this has been really a wonderful session for me, and it raised lots of bigger questions. But I guess the one that I'm going to ask you and that we're going to kind of close with is just thinking about, I'm really fascinated actually by the idea of the Constitution and what kind of role it has in different countries and different points of history. I guess because living in the United States, it's literally every day we talk about the Constitution. And it's not so much whether or not to, violate it or change or get rid of it. That's not a question. It's how do people interpret it really differently. But we're obsessed with it as the thing to return to, like what is in the Constitution. But I'm not sure every country has that kind of relationship with their constitutions. Often it's just, I guess what I'm wondering is in the Bulgarian case, and maybe thinking of it more in the European context too, like how often do people refer to the Constitution? Do they care about when they set it up, why was it important to set one up in the first place? Did people actually have some issues with it as this is a foreign imposition in some ways, and so maybe it becomes kind of irrelevant for people, as you've said, even yourself, as kind of this non-constitutional culture in a sense. But really, is it something that people are returning to and by people, I mean, probably mostly elite voices, but as a point, is it a point of reference at all in over these political periods, whether it's sort of the czar talking about it or political parties? Is it something they return to? I think it's interesting even that the communists had a constitution. If you read it, you're it reads pretty similarly to any other, it guarantees every kind of possible political freedom and individual freedom. But it's, but you can interpret that however you want, So the interpretation is always really kind of fascinating as well. So anyway, it's a huge question, but I just thought I would throw that out there.
I mean, I can only really, again, when we talk about this constitutional culture in Bulgaria, my impression is that even nowadays, the constitution is not that much in the center of the common interests and common debates in Bulgaria than as much as it is in other countries. And this, in a way, would also connect or would in a way seem logical given the very limited relevance that the constitution had in Bulgaria since 1878. So it seems that basically at any point in time, the people were not extremely concerned about breaking or the constitution or remaining loyal to the constitution. I don't want to get too much into such stories where, like, because you're running the risk of running into cliches when you say, yes, in Balkan societies, you know, this dominance of informal culture or of informality in social life and so on and so forth. So this idea, like a law is like a door that is standing in an open field. Yeah, you can walk through it, you can also walk around it. Don't want to get too much into that. Yeah. And in particular, also because I think particularly the common, post-communist constitution in Bulgaria has proven to be functional. I do not have the impression that it really is very strongly part of the Bulgarians' national identity. I think it is much more part of American national identity. It is also very strongly part of the common national political identity in Germany, even in the East German federal states. So actually, I'm in a way, actually, I'm quite surprised even how deeply the constitution, or how has been, or how comprehensively the constitution has been also kind of adopted and internalized by the majority of the East Germans. Here in Bulgaria, it's not that nobody talks about the constitution, but I don't see this really as a crucial element in the public discourses. I don't see it as something that is part of people's national identity. They do not really identify it in the same way as people do it in America, for example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll see everyone in a couple weeks, and this will bring our session to a close. And welcome. Thank you everyone for coming to Balkan Circle.